To use AMD's word, AMD really jebaited itself on this one. The RX 5600 XT was nearly dead on arrival because somehow AMD didn't predict NVIDIA's most predictable move in the playbook, lowering the price of a competitive video card when AMD launches a new one. EVGA's RTX 2060 KO launched briefly at $280, then stabilized at $300, and some of our board partner contacts tell us that this created panic at AMD. The ensuing panic resulted in a last-minute VBIOS change that removed some of the 5600 XT's restrictions, pushing it ever closer to cannibalizing the RX 5700, which AMD was trying to avoid from the beginning. The company still has artificial overclocking limitations in place, and they are easily bypassed, but it's clear that it didn't want to create a higher power consumption RX 5600 XT. Ultimately, it's good that AMD did issue that last-minute VBIOS change. We're just worried that most of the launch day retail cards won't have the new VBIOS applied. In order to make sure the review represents what you're buying, we benchmarked 4 combinations of BIOS for the RX 5600 XT. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Drop and Hi-Fi Man HE4XX planar magnetic headphones. The HE4XX headphones focus on high-quality audio listening experiences with comfortable foam cushions for the ear cups. Comfort is also ensured with a leather-covered spring steel headband, allowing flexibility and durability against bends. These headphones are capable of delivering big sound for audiophiles while being positioned competitively in price. Learn more at the link in the description below. So to be clear here, it's a good thing that AMD decided to increase its clocks and power consumption at launch for the 5600 XT. It's a bit awkward for the company, but the alternative would have been launching in its original state, which you'll see those numbers in our review too, and being declared dead on arrival. Sure, it would have competed with the 1660 Super, but it would have been killed by the 2060, which is now at a similar price. So, the card was supposed to be 135 to 150 watt TDP on average, or at least power budget on average through VBIOS. Its price is supposed to be around $280. The card we're reviewing today, this one from Sapphire, is $290 or so, or it's supposed to be, and it looks good against the 1660 Ti. The 1660 Ti is a card that NVIDIA should have killed, and hopefully NVIDIA has learned its lesson now. It also would perform the 1660 Super without competing too directly in price. They're in sort of different pricing categories, so AMD could stand out on its own. The 5600 XT is a card that we wanted to exist because AMD really had nothing outside of the sub $200 class and then the $300+ class. There wasn't anything in between there to hit the market that this one is trying to hit. The real problem is that somehow AMD didn't consider that NVIDIA might lower its prices, which is literally the only thing NVIDIA has ever done when AMD's launched the cards. That was a bit odd. Hopefully, though, there's something of a lesson here to NVIDIA as well, because if the company had killed its 1660 Ti originally, like we said it should have, because there's a 5% delta between that and the 1660 Super, and the price isn't worth it at all, then AMD would have been forced to compare it to the 1660 Super, because they're not going to compare it to a dead card. And the price there would have been less, it would have been less clean cut as to who wins the battle, because the 1660 Super is a good amount cheaper. So the comparison would have been the 1660 Super, where AMD is more expensive, or the 2060, where it potentially loses in some games. And instead they compared to the 1660 Ti, where it's an easy win. Either way, we're here now, and here's what's going on. There's a last-minute VBIOS push that couldn't possibly have landed before most of the cards landed at retailers. So a couple things to consider here. The cards were shipped, for the most part, before the VBIOS change went out. For those that were shipped after VBIOS change went out, there's still a problem. It's probably not applied to a lot of them. And that's because Lunar New Year is here and aligned with this launch, so most of the factories that would be responsible for applying this VBIOS change to the card shipping were already out the door on vacation. And it can last, depending on where you are, in parts of China, it can be, the factories we work with can be 3 weeks of vacation, so it might be a little while. So, and in Taiwan it's typically about a week. But if you end up buying one of these cards on launch day or launch week, and your numbers don't match with what a lot of reviewers are seeing, it's because of the VBIOS, and you can update it. It's fairly easy. Use AMD Flash. It's not something that is a good user or out-of-box experience, especially for people who are less informed, but it's not difficult. Just be aware that you might need to do that. For people who don't know if it's worth it, we've tested it for you, and the short version is that it's about 11% faster with the newer VBIOS. There's another thing we wanted to bring up briefly too. about AMD having no idea what it's doing with launches before we get into the benchmarks. So somehow still AMD has completely lost control of how it handles GPU launches. The CPU team needs to talk to the GPU team and tell them how to run a company or something. But basically, there's technically a ban on us reviewing multiple cards today. We're allowed to review other cards tomorrow, and I could do it anyway and say screw you to AMD. And we did that with the 5500 XT when we had the Power Color and the Sapphire cards on the same review. The reason we're not doing it this time is because that gets the board partner in a whole hell of a lot of trouble. So even if we can get away with it, we don't want to throw board partners under the bus. Basically, the problem is that technically we can only review the card AMD sent us, even though we have cards from the partners directly, and they're updated, by the way. And our understanding is that certain partners are pressuring AMD into only allowing their card, as in their specific card, to be reviewed on launch day by the outlets that were sent the card. We're not sure specifically, or at least not naming specifically which partners, but it's because they don't want to be compared unfavorably against some of the other board partner competitors. This is something that we don't really hear about with previous launches or NVIDIA launches, and it's very strange that AMD is allowing itself to be bullied around by its partners and sort of just plain sad. But we'll talk more about this tomorrow when we're technically allowed to review other partner cards and give you a fuller picture. For today, we're focusing on VBIOS comparisons with extensive frequency, thermal, overclocking, and gaming benchmarks to better look at how that last-minute change affects performance, thermals, power, and everything else. We'll start with the frequency comparison between the 4 VBIOS revisions, since that's going to most directly illustrate the performance impact in the gaming results later. This chart is intentionally zoomed in to illustrate the differences more visibly. The original performance VBIOS averaged about 1611 MHz relatively flatly throughout a Firestrike Extreme frame repeat render. Note that the dips down in the middle are a reporting error in AMD's API and are not actual frequency results. The new performance VBIOS issued at the last minute by AMD ran at 1740 MHz or so an increase of about 130 MHz from baseline. That's a big jump. For reference, although it's not shown here, the RX 5700 Red Dragon non-XT card averaged about 1780 to 1800 MHz, so it's not that different from the 5600 XT post-update. The original silent VBIOS averaged roughly the same frequency as the original performance VBIOS, just about 10 MHz lower on average. The updated silent VBIOS held around 1717 to 1730 MHz average, which is another dramatic uptick in frequency. These changes are marked and will have a notable impact on gaming, but do come at an obvious cost. We'll go over the thermal and power changes later to illustrate what those costs are. Before getting into the thermal comparison with the interposer power numbers using our custom monitoring hardware, we can look at the VBIOS power budget configuration using FurMark and 3DMark. FurMark fully maxes the board against its VBIOS limits, while 3DMark will produce more of a gaming workload with less maxed out power consumption. This is all automated, so the charts line up pretty cleanly. FurMark is the more important chart here, and we'll start with that one. It creates a firmer understanding of where the limitations lie because we hit the TGP, or the total maximum power consumption permissible by VBIOS. The original performance VBIOS had a limit of about 150 watts, with the original silent VBIOS at around 134 watts. There's a reasonable difference here, and enough of one to establish a gap in fan profiling as well. The new performance VBIOS pushes that to 160 to 165 watts, with the new silent VBIOS about the same as the old one, around 135 watts. 3DMark is next, mostly useful to illustrate that games aren't a great way to see the total maximum power limit of VBIOS. In this chart, the RX 5600 XT original performance VBIOS ran at about 110 watts as monitored by the card's own hardware, but that's not because it was limited to 110, it's because that's just where the workload managed to max it out. This means that it will only boost the clock as high as it can get at 110 watts under the workload that 3DMark produces, as opposed to FurMark, where frequency runs lower but power runs higher. So that's about 1611 MHz in our original frequency plot with gaming workloads. The new performance VBIOS has a power limit of about 140 watts, or at least a power measurement of 140 watts in this particular benchmark. Either way, it's topping out at 140 in testing here, and that's where the extra 130 MHz comes from. The original silent VBIOS didn't have a very different power limit and looked about the same, so we're not sure if it even behaved much differently from a power management perspective. The average clock was close enough that it may not have been different at all, though we can look for fan behavior to see how it changes later. The new silent VBIOS held at about 123 to 130 watts, so it's about 10 to 17 watts lower than the new performance VBIOS in this workload. That's enough to establish an actual difference between them at least, and we can move on to some thermal numbers to get a better idea. Thermal benchmarks are next. We'll move on to 40 dBA noise normalized thermals after looking at auto performance numbers. The 40 dBA numbers are necessary to establish actual thermal changes resultant of the power limitation changes, since fans will need to be controlled for visibility into that result difference. We'll start with the auto performance impact though. With the fans allowed to do whatever VBIOS wants them to do, the new silent VBIOS performs best at 80.2 degrees Celsius junction and 74 degrees edge. The 3-degree delta is actually pretty impressive here, we'll say again later, but this indicates good mounting between the GPU and the cooler. The original silent VBIOS ran about the same and within variance. This all makes sense, as the fan speed was roughly identical, power budget was about the same, and the frequency was about the same. The new performance VBIOS and the old performance VBIOS run at about the same temperature as well, but there was a fan RPM difference, so the new performance VBIOS runs louder, or if you were to fix them to the same fan speed, then the newer performance VBIOS would run hotter instead, with them at the same noise level, and we'll look at that in a moment. We'll continue auto thermals and look at GDDR6 and VRM MOS temperatures. For these, the GDDR6 thermals are well within spec. We're far away from the rough 105 maximum junction temperature of GDDR6 modules, with the results all within about 1 degree Celsius of each other. The only real difference here is that the higher fan RPM on the newer performance VBIOS benefits the memory disproportionately to the GPU in the previous tests, and so we see better results here for the newer VBIOS. Before getting to the 40 dBA testing, this chart will show the fan behavior for each of the previous auto speed tests. The original performance fan RPM was required to run at about 860 to maintain its temperature target, a fan speed that's almost too low and is nearing 30 dBA at 20 inches. The new performance VBIOS had a big uptick in power and frequency, and so the fan ramped to about 1000 RPM to hold steady. We still think Sapphire could have been more aggressive on its fan profiling, but the company has done this in the past too. You might want to use a manually configured fan profile instead, as we're still well below 40 dBA at 20 inches, which is established at 1600 RPM on this card, and even below 35 dBA. The fans could have run much more aggressively, but we don't have any thermals that show it needed to run faster, at least in an open bench. So favoring noise isn't too bad. Just be aware that there's plenty of room to build your own fan curve if you're working in a hotter ambient temperature or you just have a hotter case to work with. Overall, the card's cooling solution is performing well. We don't have comparisons against other 5600 XTs yet, so we don't know how it does versus the competition, but strictly against specifications, we're well within spec, and it's running objectively quietly, and when it's running quietly, it's not running too hot. So things seem fine here, even if there might be better options out there, but we haven't tested those yet, and we'll have to look at those to get an idea of what's going on separately. As for the silent fan speeds, those both sat at about 790 to 800 RPM and were unchanged with the VBIOS update. The next thermal tests use 40 dBA noise normalized testing to establish an equal footing in the benchmark. This allows us to eliminate the fan speed changes that were incurred from the VBIOS change because we'd otherwise be unable to isolate how thermals are affected by the increased power budget alone. Locking fan speed is a necessity to do this properly. The best performer is the set of silent VBIOSes, which are within test error and variance of each other. The performance VBIOS originally ran at about 68 degrees when the card was controlled, or an edge temperature of about 60 degrees. The newer update with the controlled fan speed still and higher power consumption pushed to 72 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees edge, and this is a like-for-like comparison. That's notably an increase of about 4 to 5 degrees junction or about 4 degrees edge, but not one that ruins the performance on this card. Sapphire had the headroom to accommodate this change, fortunately, so this is one of the cards that will fare better overall as compared to cards that were maybe more slimmed down for this launch before the VBIOS update. For GDDR6 thermals at 40 dBA fan speeds, the original and new silent VBIOSes both ran at about 60 degrees Celsius and are within variance. The MOSFET temperatures for both of these entries are also equal at 49 degrees Celsius, which is way below spec, so things are looking good for the VRM thermals. The original performance VBIOS ran at about 64 degrees for GDDR6 and 53 degrees for the VRM MOS temperature, both of which are fine. The newer performance VBIOS ran a couple of degrees hotter for each component, but not in a way that meaningfully changes the cooler's ability to keep the card at good temperature measurements when under non-overclocked settings. Power consumption benchmarks are next. For this, we're using a custom interposer that we built to monitor power consumption at a hardware level, not using any software here, and we're testing at the PCIe slot and at the PCIe cables for 12 volts alike. And it's also much more reliable and much more accurate than on-card monitoring that GPU-Z reads because you can't compare those numbers between NVIDIA and AMD. The Sapphire RX 5600 XT original performance VBIOS had a TDP of 150 watts. In this particular firmware excursion, we measured its average, capping out at about 143 watts. As for the updated performance VBIOS, we were running 178 watts in firmware, which is about 18 watts over the specified limit, and at about 170.4 watts in TimeSpy's memory-focused test, about 10 watts over the new supposed limit. GT1 had us at the appropriate power consumption of 160 watts for the complete card consumption. Overclocking the 5600 XT put the power consumption to about 197 watts in firmware and about 180 to 187 watts in TimeSpy Extreme, where it saw a significant increase in power consumption. AMD and NVIDIA are pretty close for power parity as compared to previous generations, which is overall a good thing for AMD as the company has been behind in this category for years. But it's not going to keep that lead because as soon as NVIDIA moves to 7 nanometers also, AMD is going to lose that advantage that it's gained from the process shrink. For F1 2018, as a gaming workload with power consumption, our 1440p testing had the original card at about 124 watts or 130 watts at 4K, with the new VBIOS at 158 watts for 4K and 150 watts for 1440p. For comparison, the RTX 2060 FE draws about 149 watts at 1440p and about 155 watts at 4K, which puts the two devices at power parity. For reference, the RX 5700 reference card, non-XT by AMD, drew 180 watts here, so it's nearly the same as the 5700 in power consumption now. Finally, time to move on to games. Sniper Elite gives us a good foundational benchmark for a well-built DirectX 12 game. We like to use this one as a best case representation for game optimization. We also have a lot of data for it, so it's easier for us to compare years and years of testing. That's why we keep it on board for this. The RX 5600 XT stock GPU plays at 51 FPS average with its original VBIOS. As a reminder, this type of testing isn't about just straight numbers as much as it is about comparative numbers with other cards. That's what really matters. A lot of the launch day card purchases will look more like this 51 FPS number, but a VBIOS flash will put them closer to our 57 FPS average score, an increase of 11.7%. The RTX 2060 KO runs at 55 FPS average for its $300 price point. In theory, anyway, that's what it's supposed to be, with a 7% increase to 59 FPS average when overclocked. Note that the KO can't increase power budget, but the FE can. That puts it at 62 FPS average when you do have the extra power headroom to play with, and the RX 600 XT card with its new VBIOS is competitive with the 2060 KO, and at its $290 price is something we could recommend in games like this one. This card would have been dead on arrival against the $300 2060 if not for that VBIOS change. As for the RX 5700, it does start to get cannibalized a bit, but it's still better than the 5600 XT overall. The 1660 Super's 44 FPS average allowed the original 5600 XT 51 FPS average a lead of 17%, but you can still see why AMD increased the performance when considering the 1660 Super's lower price. Our 1080p chart is more limited since we quickly become CPU bound. For this one, the 5600 XT with the older VBIOS ran notably worse at 136 FPS average and leading the 1660 Super's 121 FPS average by 13%. The VBIOS update pushed it to 150 FPS average, an improvement over the initial shipment VBIOS of 10%. Considering the old VBIOS was getting wrecked by the 2060 KO stock card at 14%, this change was necessary. It pushed the two closer in performance, and considering the $290, that was a needed change to compete. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, another DirectX 12 game worth looking at. We tested this one at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. We're starting with our 1080p results though. The RX 5600 XT with its original VBIOS landed at 93 FPS average, with lows at 79 FPS and 74 FPS 0.1%, which are both well spaced and illustrate consistent frame time pacing. The GTX 1660 Super OC roughly equated the original VBIOS stock performance, but did so while costing $230 instead of $290. This is why AMD issued that VBIOS change. The 5600 XT was close to being, again, dubbed DOA, but the VBIOS change with a slower, silent option even pushed it up to 97 FPS average. Still, a gain of 4.5% over the original VBIOS, while the like-for-like swap to the new performance VBIOS moved to 103 FPS average, or a gain of 11% over the original VBIOS. That puts the 5600 XT stock card about equal with an RTX 2060 KO. The 5700 Red Dragon, non-XT, still runs 9.5% higher frame rate than the new 5600 XT, so the 5600 XT doesn't encroach too much on the RX 5700 territory. In this instance, the RTX 2060 at $300 versus the 5600 XT at $290 achieves functional equivalence in performance, and the two are indistinguishable. We don't really consider RTX, or ray tracing technology or performance as it's more aptly dubbed, to be much of a value add at the moment, especially on a 2060. It's something to consider though, that's if you have a specific desire for it. What we do consider a value add is that the NVIDIA drivers work reliably, while AMD's drivers are still a known pain point and require more work from AMD. Where AMD had a more stable victory in Sniper, we'd have to assign choice to the 2060 in this title. Pricing is close enough and performance is about the same, but we can't let AMD get away with its drivers forever. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p has the RX 5700 XT's original performance VBIOS at 62 FPS average, ranking it as better than a 1660 Super stock card by about 6.5%. It's also 20% more expensive. If you buy a 5600 XT, you should make sure that yours shipped with the update. The update pushes things to 69 FPS average at rough parity with the RTX 2060 KO stock card in both price and performance. Overclocking the KO got it to 73 FPS average with the 5600 XT OC at 71.4, and hardly worth the effort. As for a more expensive card, the RX 5700 Red Dragon runs at 77 FPS average and starts around $342. The 4K test is really here just for showing scaling and bandwidth testing. We know that none of the cards in this category are really meant for this workload. The newer VBIOS granted an 11.8% uplift to the old one here, a bit more than at 1080p, but it's not like any of it matters anyway. The memory bandwidth jaunt helps at this high resolution as well. It's just that we're still below playable frame rates for 4K resolution. F1 2018 is up now, giving us a DirectX 11 look at performance for something more traditional. For F1 2018, the Sapphire RX 5600 XT ran at 115 FPS average stock, 118 FPS average with the new silent VBIOS, and 125 FPS average with the updated performance VBIOS that's supposed to ship on the cards as AMD rolls the updates out. The newer result puts it about on par with an RTX 2060 KO, although we'll note that AMD routinely delivers better frame time consistency in this particular benchmark, so it has more of a lead than the averages would let on. We'd hand this title to the 5600 XT over the 2060 KO. The 1660 Super card, meanwhile, when overclocked, is, as far as the cheapest model can go anyway, achieves about 85% of the total performance of the 125 FPS average performance VBIOS for the 5600 XT, strictly for the averages, further establishing the necessity of AMD's last-minute change. As for the 5700, the Red Dragon sits at 136 FPS average, a lead over the 5600 XT 125 result of 8.5%. That's not as big of a gap as would have existed previously, but it's still a reasonable gap, and considering NVIDIA has a card, it feels like every $50 at this point, 8.5% is more meaningful than the gains we see in NVIDIA's 16 series stack. Overclocking the 5600 XT gets it to 128 FPS average, not worth the effort at all for a 2.2% increase in average frame rate, so we'll just move on. At 1440p, the 5600 XT managed 96 FPS average, outperforming the KO notably in frame time consistency, as expected for this benchmark, but also outperforming average frame rate by about 3%. The RX 5700 Red Dragon maintains an 8% lead over the 5600 XT at 104 FPS average, but it costs about $50 more depending on which one you buy. That's not a game changer in this scenario, as the jump isn't enough to move you from 1440 to 4K in most instances. A slight graphics settings reduction on the XT would account for that 8% pretty easily anyway. Overclocking the 5600 XT puts it just beyond the 2060 KO OC, finally establishing something of a more meaningful lead over the KO OC card. At 4K, the 5600 XT manages 57 FPS average, but lows are beginning to suffer and frame time consistency is undesirable. The 5700 is in roughly the same boat. Average FPS is marginally better, but meaningless overall to experience, and frame time consistency isn't fixed with the upgrade. In either situation, or in the situation of the RTX 2060, you're likely moving down to 1440p, or you're seriously downgrading the graphics quality. GTA 5 is last. At 1080p, the RX 5600 XT original VBIOS ran at 105 FPS average, which is about equal to a 1070 SC and barely better than a 1660 Super stock card. The updated VBIOS puts it up to 117 FPS average, outpacing the 2060 KO by 2.8 to 2.9%. Overclocking the KO gets it marginally ahead of the 5600 XT OC, but at this point, Silicon Lottery will dictate the final 1 FPS delta anyway, so it doesn't matter. The 5600 XT is holding better 0.1% lows for what that's worth, and as for the 5700 Red Dragon, that holds a 13% lead over the new VBIOS 5600 XT's at 117 FPS average, with its 131 FPS average for the 5700 Red Dragon. And we'll come back to that 2060 versus 5600 XT numbering at 4K as well, where you'll see some interesting flipping of the scale. At 1440p, the 5600 XT holds at 82 FPS average for the new VBIOS, or 84 when overclocked. The 2060 KO holds a technical lead in average and a technical loss, albeit not far outside of variance for lower frame time consistency. The Red Dragon 5700 leads both by a reasonable margin, although its pricing is less desirable with the new 5600 XT encroaching on its positioning. GTA at 4K is just here for more scaling checks, not for actual playability testing. The 5600 XT OC yields a 2.7% increase over stock, so things haven't changed much here. And the power increase of 9% isn't a linear gain either. The stock VBIOS runs at roughly parity, with an undervolted and overclocked Vega 56 at around 40 to 41 FPS average, and the 2060 KO manages 7.6% improvement over the 40.6 FPS 5600 XT result. That's a massive lead when compared to the 2.2% increase we saw at 1440p and the 2.9% deficit at 1080p. That's why we have these 4K numbers in here. They reveal interesting things, even if they're not particularly actionable. In this instance, AMD is becoming memory bandwidth starved, as Navi has proven in some scenarios from the beginning, and we have more reason to spend time overclocking your memory if you're going to overclock anything at all. Overall, the 5600 XT with its updates is fairly competitive. It's a big change from what we would be saying if that update hadn't taken place. So overall, this is a good change that AMD's made, although in an extremely sloppy and disorganized fashion that makes the company look like, well, incompetent once again for a GPU launch. So this is it's a good change. You might need to apply it yourself if you're an early adopter. If you're not, you're probably fine if you're watching this video in a month from launch or something like that. But just be aware of that. The card is competitive with the 2060 now with that VBIOS change, where it wouldn't really have been that directly competitive otherwise. The pricing with it, actually I should make a note too, not all of the cards will be able to push the power as high as this one did. If they have really bad coolers on them, then they won't be able to push as hard. But we're reviewing this one today, so that's all we care about right now. Anyway, for other information, overclocking is not particularly worth it. You could get power play tables and make it worth it. So if you're willing to do some more tweaking, we'd encourage looking into power play tables and basically turning your 5600 XT into a 5700 non-XT, because they're the same GPU. There's a few changes to them, some things are fused off, and there's artificial limitations on overclocking. But with the new VBIOS and with power play tables, which you can grab from Igor's lab, for example, you can easily turn this into a 5700. Now, of course, you could always, it's an arms race. You could make the 5700 get close to a 5700 XT with the same mods. But if you don't have the budget for that, then this is a good way to grab at 5700 performance without spending the extra, whatever it is, 40, 50 bucks, something like that. So that's a good consideration as well. A couple things though. Power parity. AMD's finally at power parity. They have been for this generation. They're fine versus the 2060. It's about the same. So that's good for AMD. It's not really something that's been true before, and that's an upside. The one thing to keep in mind is that AMD did have to move to 7 nanometer for this, and once NVIDIA gets a move on with its new architecture, that parity is going to go away, but they're certainly a lot closer than they used to be. As for the drivers and the recommendations, overall, in terms of raw performance, the 5600 XT is fine. It's not particularly exciting, but it's also not completely damned to oblivion like it would have been. The place where we hesitate, again, is going to be the drivers. And this time, before this review, I sent a couple people home with 5700 XT cards, and we've been testing them in home environments, not just in the lab. So we have a wider well, one, more people looking at the cards, and two, more games, more hardware configurations, more software configurations. So we have a good amount of data now on AMD's drivers in real use cases outside of the lab, and we're running into issues. So multi-monitor, still, there's a lot of issues with different multi-monitor configurations. We'll talk about all this later in a separate thing. 144 hertz monitors we've had issues with. We get black screens and stuttering in some game menus. Star Wars, for example, is one of them. We've had black screens on the primary monitor when waking the system from sleep. Recently, Jake on our team tried adjusting the volume on his computer, and you know that little volume thing that pops up, when that appeared, his frame rate in the game he was playing dropped to 30 FPS until the Windows volume adjuster icon disappeared. We've seen abnormally long loading times in some games with DX12, and again, more on that later, and had an issue that can't be routinely reproduced, but we can reproduce sometimes. BPS Customs also saw this on Twitter, and the issue is when installing the drivers, you sometimes get an error 1603 and a message stating no ADL load :WXZ on startup. I didn't encounter this in my testing. I only use these cards on the test bench in here, which is an extremely clean environment. So no idea what causes that and what doesn't, but we didn't see it in testing. We saw it in real world use at a home system. Lower end games like Subnautica sometimes yield worse performance. This one's really interesting on low and medium settings, and we were able to reproduce this issue by setting those settings in Subnautica. But the problem is that the GPU doesn't seem to understand it's a game and that it's supposed to boost, so it sits there under 1,000 megahertz and runs poorly. Enabling and disabling FreeSync has caused some of our monitors to lose connection to the PC. Sometimes there are intermittent black screens in some games. Radeon overlay sometimes forces mouse movement right input. So if you open the Radeon overlay while you're playing a game where the mouse left-right movements can be used to turn, like a game with Star Wars Battlefront 2, maybe something like that, then what will happen is with the overlay open, it'll force a mouse movement right, even if that's not what you were doing. So the point is there's a lot of bugs still. Now, as for what I've personally seen in testing, I don't run into as many of these. All of the problems I run into are related to the overclocking software, the fan controls, all that stuff. You've heard me complain about it for years now, but none of that really is experience ruining for people who don't mess around with overclocking, so you're kind of fine in that case. That said, it was a good move to send some of our people home with these AMD cards because I haven't seen this other stuff in the lab, but we are reproducing issues that many of you have complained about in our comments now, so something to consider. The takeaway here is that the 5600 XT is fine, and as AMD gets its drivers together, or perhaps you want to just buy it and see how it works for you, it's not a bad purchase, but the problem is we don't know how it's going to work for you, and that makes me extremely hesitant to recommend it one way or the other, because I don't want to tell everyone to buy this thing because it's competitive with the 2060 at slightly cheaper, but then have people say, my computer says no ADL load WXZ. What does that mean? Because I don't know the answer to that. So that's our review of it. Check back for more as always. We'll have another content piece later because AMD is not allowing coverage of other video cards for launch day, which is stupid, and the launch is kind of messy, and overall makes AMD look like half of its, I guess it's maybe marketing or something. Someone over there is doing a very bad job, and hopefully it's fixed. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.